change his understanding and views of race relations. So, and this is something that, again, especially if you read the last listen to the speech, the last, I'll say, 4 months of his life, he also started to speak less about black nationalism. And not to say that, again, black nationalism meaning the advocacy of the civil rights of black people, is not to say that he wasn't speaking about that anymore, but in the conversation he had with Gordon Parks, he spoke about that racism is not just a black and white thing. It's not just between black people and white people. Ultimately, even when someone asked him 4 months before he passed away, what do you think is the cause for racism in America? He said 3 things: ignorance, greed, and a sophisticated system where Americans miseducate people, the education system. And he says, so just because you've got like colleges, again I'm paraphrasing here, just because you've got colleges and universities, it doesn't mean people are educated. And that's something that he wanted to let people know that, okay, although his main fight was for the upliftment of black people and black empowerment, he wasn't solely fighting for black people, right? And that's something, again, I think that we should, in terms of understand Malcolm's identity, first and foremost, was a Muslim. He was someone that considered himself a Muslim and also an African living in America. And that idea of being an African living in America, that came from his father more than anyone else. And his father was a Garveyite. And I don't know if I'm sure people have seen the famous film directed by Spike Lee, where that phrase where his father I think it's in the beginning of the film where he's talking about I'm an African living in America, and Malcolm reiterated the same kind of sentiment whilst he was preaching for the Nation of Islam, and also when in a number of interviews when he became a Sunni Muslim. So it's not like when he became an Orthodox Muslim he forgot about being African and it's just I'm a Muslim and that's it, I don't see race. He did mention that although he's a Muslim and Islam has caused him not to see the person's colour, meaning he tries to judge a person by their character, he's a realist at the same time. So the same way as me saying, because I'm I'm not sexist, so I don't see gender. Of course I see gender, so obviously, and that's why naturally you treat, well, maybe that's not right to say, but you treat a woman differently compared to how you treat a man. I'm a traditionalist in terms of respect, not you treat them less, but you see these things the same way in terms of the plight of black people in America is not the same as the plight of white people, and that's something which he was trying to address and also to enlighten black people. Can everyone understand what I'm saying? I'm not speaking too fast or anything, because again the most important thing is that you understand what I'm saying, and hopefully you go away from this talk not only, and I want to hear some of your discussions after, but I want to kind of see where everyone's at, kind of thing.
Sure.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about okay, so we know that Malcolm embraced Islam, but one thing, and again, just like myself as a Muslim, and this is something which kind of does, and that's why when I was speaking to Nadia, I wanted to kind of talk about this issue, is amongst the Muslim, or I would say Arab and Asian Muslim, predominantly Arab and Asian Muslim communities, I've noticed like a tendency when the topic of Malcolm X is spoken about, of course, again, as Muslims will
whitewash Malcolm.
Yeah, she's just very blunt. I was trying to say a nicer way of saying it, but
I've got a reputation.
Okay, right, yeah, okay, so she doesn't hold back, mashallah. So that was my issue. It was this idea that people try and whitewash Malcolm, similar to when Muhammad Ali passed away. This whole idea that he transcended race and race wasn't an issue, even though he was primarily fighting for black people, and he was very advocate and very, very vocal in that, and was advocate for black people, even whilst whilst white people accepted him, or mainstream America accepted him. And it's similar with Malcolm X as well. And this is something that again I wanted to talk about, and hopefully, not only I wanted to hear other people's thoughts about why that is, because that's something which I can't really understand. So I wanted to hear different people's perspective. Maybe I'm not seeing things or whatever, but it's just something that kind of bothers me, that when you have a number of predominantly non-black Muslim speakers talking about Malcolm, it's like they erase Malcolm X's struggle in terms of whilst he's during the Nation of Islam, which is important because you need to know, like I said earlier, Malcolm X, when he was during the Nation of Islam, and even prior to that, in terms of having lost his father at 6 years old, who was murdered by the KKK, his mum being sectioned in the mental hospital by the age of 13, that will have traumatic impact in terms of your upbringing. So again, not that I agree with the Nation of Islam, I can understand how they came about, and I think that's important that we, even if you don't agree with maybe from a theological perspective, they did and are continuing to do a lot of good for the black community, which has to be recognised, and you can understand how it came about because it didn't come out of a vacuum. So I think that's, even as Muslims, even if we maybe don't agree with some of what they're saying in terms of about theology, we need to understand, like, in terms of the movement, in terms of the activism, and that's something that Malcolm was wanted to stress, which even after he became a Sunni Muslim, he was very much about activism, not just preaching. And this is illustrated by, he set up 2 organizations. After he left the Nation of Islam, or was kicked out of the Nation of Islam, he set up a Muslim organization which was inclusive of everyone, irrespective of your race, but primarily teaching people about Islam. And he also set up an Afro-American, exclusively for African Americans, black empowerment organization to obviously educate black people, and also to deal with issues that are affecting primarily the 22 million African Americans in America. So I think that's very important, because he understood that he himself, and another thing as well, when people talk about Malcolm X during the Nation of Islam, and then when he became a Sunni Muslim, people say that the Sunni Malcolm was Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, when he actually was given that name when he was in the Nation of Islam. So it's not like he converted and then he changed his name. So that's another misunderstanding that some people have, because he was given that name whilst he was during the Nation of Islam. But he said when he was interviewed after he came back from Mecca that he wanted to he's still going to use the name Malcolm X, because that's the name that he's known by. That's the name that he's known by. If he was to go by Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, a lot of people, particularly you can imagine a lot of the African American who weren't Muslim, they probably wouldn't have gravitated to, because they maybe didn't want to, which they're within their right to embrace Islam, but they liked what he was doing in terms of calling for black empowerment and things like that, and in terms of his black activist struggle. So that's why he set up 2 organizations, and I think that's something that Muslims, when I'm hearing Muslims talk about Malcolm X, they talk about, like I said, obviously his famous pilgrimage to Mecca and things like that, but then in terms of his activism, his social activism, that's ignored. And that, for me, in terms of a lot of Malcolm's greatness and why he's revered by so much people across the world, is the fact that he was willing to die for his beliefs, and he was very courageous in that. Not his Islamic beliefs. Again, that's not to say it's important, but that's why he's embraced by Muslims and non-Muslims. But again, that was just some of my thoughts that I had issues with. But I wanted to kind of, in the discussions, I wanted to maybe talk to a few after, kind of hear some of your thoughts in terms of why is it within the Muslim communities in particular, Arab and Asian, or Arab isn't Asian, isn't it? So I don't want to say Arab and Asian, but you know what I mean. They kind of whitewash Malcolm, so we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail later. Another thing I wanted to kind of discuss is, why is it that Malcolm X's Islamic or Muslim belief is often ignored by Pan-Africanists or Afro or black nationalists? Has anyone read Destruction of Black Civilizations by Chancellor Williams? Excellent book. It's published in 1974. But one of the issues I had with that book, obviously being a Muslim, was, and not even being a Muslim, just even as an historian, was some of its the portrayals of Islam that I would say was inaccurate, and of the early Arabs. Now in the book, it talks about Islam as like being a white religion. So similarly how Christianity is seen as a white person's religion, Chancellor Williams in this book, and then this led to a number of other Pan-Africanists saying the same type of rhetoric in terms about Islam being a white person's religion, and it's not like an African religion, so black people shouldn't embrace this religion. So in this book in 1974, he charges Islam that it subjugated African blacks, and he identifies the Arabs as whites, by Caucasians. This book it then led to a number of other leading Pan-Africanists and Afrocentrics talking about Islam being a leading, you could say, Afrocentric crusades against Islam, particularly Black American Islam. And again, by Black American Islam, I'm talking about Sunni Islam. An example is Haki, would that forgive me if I mispronounce his name, Madhubati. Okay. He suggested in his book Enemies, The Clash of Races in 1978, that Islam was part of the global white supremacist ideology. Another professor, Professor Santi, who coined the term Afrocentricity and defined its parameters in 1980, he proclaimed that Islam was in fact contradictory to Afrocentricity, meaning like Africa or Africans are the center of, like in terms of ideology or understanding the world. Another great historian, the late Dr. John Henry Clarke, he also continued Chancellor Williams's approach to the subject in terms of seeing Islam being in contradiction to being a true African. And this is something which, even whilst I was in Brazil, and there was a talk about the Muslim presence in Brazil when I was there last November, and they spoke about Malcolm X as well and the influence that he had in terms of similar to the same way Malcolm X's conversion led to a number of African Americans embracing Islam, had the same impact not only in this country but also in Brazil as well. And there was a Pan-Africanist in the audience who was of the I believe of one of the Yoruba religions, the traditional Yoruba religions that's practiced in Brazil, particularly in northeastern Brazil. And he was talking about that. Why are we talking about Islam? Islam is a white man's religion. The same way Christianity is like a white person's religion. You need to practice a true religion. And this idea of the true religion is a true African religion. Now, one of the speakers at the time, he challenged him, and this is again something which I wanted to talk about, is this idea of a true African religion. What is a true African religion? Because even Africa itself, how many countries are in Africa? And even within like one country, there's many different ethnicities, the different cultures and the different religions itself. So this idea that there's this true African religion, and if you're somewhat becoming a true African, or if you're embracing your African heritage, therefore you should leave the religion of Islam. This is something that obviously I have an issue with. Obviously as a Muslim, I don't see myself as any way less of an African, because I believe in a religion that was established by an Arabian prophet, an Arabian man. Okay, because again, in terms of understanding, which Malcolm understood, in terms of understanding Islamic religion, which is different to the Nation of Islam, there's no superiority between a black person, a white person, Arab or non-Arab. And again, that's something that Afrocentrics or Pan-Africanists, when they're talking about Malcolm, you see that like Malcolm, when they're talking about Malcolm, they generally talk about the Malcolm that was in the Nation of Islam. And the Malcolm that was in the Nation of Islam is very different to the Malcolm that for the last year of his life. So again, that's why, again, when I said earlier in the talk, and defining these terms, it's important to understand which Malcolm we're talking about. If we're talking about the Malcolm up until the last year of his life, he rejected a lot of the views that he was saying during the 12 years while he was the minister of the Nation of Islam. But yet, those views are spoken about a lot by Afrocentrics and spoken about a lot by Pan-Africanists in terms of we need to create a separate nation for black people and things like that. So again, and this is something that Malcolm himself, which he did say, he would reject. So it's just interesting why, despite Malcolm himself saying he rejects a lot of the views that he had, a lot of these views people still talk about as if this is like the true Malcolm. And then I'll talk about some of the myths, which some of the so-called Afrocentric myths about Islam, i.e. that Islam is a non-African religion, and it's a quote-unquote white Arab religion, and ultimately that Islam, similar to Judaism and Christianity, was derived from Kemet. So we can talk a little bit about that later. And another thing which a number of Afrocentrics talk about, and Pan-Africanists, is this idea that because of what occurred in Islamic history, like the slave revolts which took place in 9th century Iraq, when there was a number of black East African Muslims known as the Zanj, when they rebelled against their slave masters, their Arab slave masters. A lot of Pan-Africanists, and I've had many discussions with Pan-Africanists, they attribute this to the religion. Right? So the same way, and I think this is doing an injustice to religion, the same way I think it's an injustice for not only black people, but even brown people, whatever, to attribute what the transatlantic slave trade to Christianity. So because the Catholic Church, a number of Christians in the name of Christianity, they endorse slavery and the subjugation of black people, people attribute that to Christianity and say the religion is not for Christianity, is a quote-unquote white person's religion, and it's not for black people. Well, going by that logic, then Islam is not for black people because there were a number of Muslims who, in Islamic history, who subjugated and oppressed black people. Do you understand? So I'm saying that type of logic is dangerous in a sense, because if you're going to go by that type of understanding, that's why Christianity is not for black people, then you, by the same understanding, and that's why Islam is quote unquote not for black people as well, which again, that's something which I would disagree with, and I think that's something that, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, that's something that you need to kind of think about when people talk about what is a quote unquote white religion or a European religion.
And there was different conversations that we had at previous sessions as well, actually, pertaining to this whole conversation of, I mean, how would you frame the subjugation of black people by, say, predominantly Arab people at the time? Was that actually essentially Islamic in essence, or was that actually just an Arab supremacist kind of essentially practice, you know? And if you see, obviously, the relationships of, say, even during the Prophet's time, the migration to Ethiopia and things like this, so these kind of conversations can go into it. But I think it would be really interesting to certainly pick up on that point. The idea of, although we don't want to obviously focus all our energy on that because the conversation is quite broad and there's other really interesting points that I want to pick up on, but if we can come back to that,
that's a good.
Yes, definitely.
That's a good point.
Because in the previous session, there was definitely a really valid point made by 2 points. One was the history of Timbuktu, which was a non-black brother made that point, and then a Muslim Pan-African sister said that actually it's very problematic to say, speak about the history of Timbuktu and say that, apparently advancement in education was all in the name of Islam and so on, and also I think that the slavery, which it was slavery practiced by Arabs, predominantly Arab slavery, right? Because many pieces of literature essentially call it Arab slavery. They don't really call it an Islamic slavery, so it's actually framed in different manner, because I would argue that the Arabs continue like a slavery even in parts of, I mean, they've enslaved Asians as well, and we can have those conversations even today. So I would really hope if you can bring up that point, it'd be really good to actually just address that.
Yeah, I wanted to go into that towards the end, but
no worries.
No, I'm glad you said that, because what you said about, which I think is important, I just want to quickly expand upon. And I'll go into that now, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Well, I don't want to structure this. I want to make this kind of more like a conversation, even though I'm the only one that's speaking. But in a sense where it's flowing, not just I'm going to talk A to Z and then you understand I'm getting, but just expanding upon your point about, which is true, this idea of Arab slavery. Why is it considered to be Arab slavery as opposed to, or is it Arab slavery or is it Islamic slavery? Just a quick overview in terms of Islamic history, in terms of its dealings with black people, in terms of slavery. Now, when obviously we know Islam was established in the 7th century and then it spread outside the Arabian Peninsula and started conquering other lands. Now, when and this is something that a lot of Muslims don't like to talk about because there's some uncomfortable truths about Islamic history. When Islam spread, although Islam spread and is kind of seen as the golden age of Islam, a sense of Arab superiority started to develop amongst many of the Arab Muslims, which many people don't talk about. And one of the things which, again, although Islam was embraced Arabs, black people, Europeans, and also after Asians as well, what a number of the Arab Muslims did in the 9th century was, in order to become a Muslim, you had to join an Arab tribe, which again, that's not from Islam, that's going back to Arab culture. So in order to become like a quote unquote proper Muslim, you had to align yourself with a certain Arab tribe and become like a Mawali, which again, that's something that they introduced, but that's not part of the religion.
That's just an attribution.
Yeah, that's something that they introduced, right? Now, in terms of the enslavement of black people, the Arabs did not only enslave black people, they enslaved other Arabs and also enslaved Europeans. But they then they did target a number of black people, particularly the black Africans in East Africa. But that did, and some of it was primarily because they were black, and because they were influenced by theories from the ancient Greeks that black people are naturally submissive to slavery, and then naturally that's they're well equipped in the curse of Ham theory and story from the Bible and stuff, and they use it as a form of justification to enslave black people, right? So the same way you had that with the transatlantic slave trade, you did have that in Islamic history. Now, I wouldn't say that's Islamic because that's not from a religion, right? So that's why I would say it's Arab slave trade. The same way I would not say that what the transatlantic slave trade, which the white Christian Europeans, what they did to black Africans, I wouldn't say it's a Christian slave trade. I would say that it's a European slave trade. Do you understand? Again, I think we as we can accuse, and I think even as Muslims or non-white people, we like to point the finger at white people in Europe and say they did this in the name of Christianity, but there were also Muslims who did similar things that you could argue that was in the name of Islam. But you wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. Do you understand?
Yeah, sure.
That's why I wouldn't ascribe, because I mean, even like the recent Birth of a Nation film, which was interesting if anyone hasn't seen it or even read the book. You had, and the reason why the film was so interesting, you had the slave masters who was using slavery to oppress black people, but you also had a slave who was using a Bible to fight against slavery. Do you understand what I'm getting at? So you can use like the Bible the same way the Quran. You can use it to like you can try and manipulate it and say it means this, it means that. But obviously, if you actually read it, it's quite clear. I'll argue that the Bible somewhat is a bit more. It can be manipulated more than the Quran in terms of how you can subjugate slaves and stuff like that. Because there's some verses which is quite problematic when it's in the Quran. It's not that you haven't. But in saying that, slavery wasn't abolished by Islam. So slavery was still practiced in Islamic history, but